What if I told you that more than 2,000 years before the Roman legions ever marched across Europe, there existed an empire so vast, so meticulously organized, that it stretched from the burning deserts of Libya to the frozen peaks of the Hindu Kush? And what if I told you that this empire built by visionaries, dreamers, and ruthless conquerors was united not by fear, but by an idea so revolutionary, it would shape the concept of civilization itself? This is the story of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. From the humble rise of Cyrus the Great, who declared one of humanity's first charters of human rights, to the towering ambition of Xerxes, who sought to bring the world to its knees. This is the saga of kings who believed they could rule not just land, but destiny. Imagine cities glowing with gold, royal roads spanning continents, messengers racing faster than the sun, and kings whose every decision echoed across empires. But behind the splendor lies betrayal, rebellion, and one fatal dream of total domination that would bring even the greatest empire to its knees. Stay with me, because what begins with a shepherd's son will end with a god-king's downfall. Chapter 1. The Birth of an Empire, Cyrus and the Dream of Order. The story begins in the 6th century BCE, in the rugged, sun-bleached lands of ancient Persia, modern-day Iran. Here, amid mountains and dry plains, a small kingdom called Anshan waited in the shadows of great powers. To the west loomed the mighty kingdom of Lydia. To the east, the enigmatic civilizations of Bactria and beyond. Persia, at this time, was little more than a cluster of tribes, diverse, ambitious, and fiercely proud. But from this seeming insignificance would rise a man who would forever alter the course of history. Cyrus II. Known to the world as Cyrus the Great, have you ever wondered how one man could unite dozens of feuding tribes and build an empire that would humble the greatest kings of his age? Cyrus did not rise through brute force alone. He rose through something far more powerful, vision. Born around 600 BCE, Cyrus was a prince of modest beginnings, heir to a local dynasty under the Median Empire. The Medes ruled Persia, then a proud people who dominated their vassals through military might. Young Cyrus was technically a subordinate, yet his lineage traced back to ancient rulers who once held power in their own right. His story, as later chronicled by Herodotus, begins almost mythically. According to legend, Astyages, the Median king, had a dream that his daughter's child would one day overthrow him. Fearing this prophecy, Astyages ordered the infant Cyrus to be killed. But fate intervened. The royal servant tasked with murdering the child could not bring himself to do it. Instead, he handed the baby to a humble shepherd's family, who raised him as their own. Years later, destiny revealed itself in an unexpected way. The boy Cyrus, growing up among peasants, displayed a natural authority that astonished everyone around him. When he was eventually discovered and brought back to court, Astyages, unaware of who he truly was, spared him. But the prophecy could not be undone. In time, the grown Cyrus rose against his grandfather and led a rebellion so swift and decisive that the Median Empire fell to its own vassal. That moment marked the birth of the Achaemenid Empire. Cyrus took control not merely as a conqueror, but as a unifier. He understood that ruling diverse peoples required something stronger than fear. It required legitimacy. Where others ruled through destruction, Cyrus ruled through understanding. One of his first acts was to integrate the Median administrative system rather than destroy it. He adopted Median nobles into his government, preserving stability while asserting his authority. This was the first spark of what would become the Persian model of governance, an empire built on respect for culture, language, and local traditions. Then came the conquests, brilliant, bold, and seemingly unstoppable. In 546 BCE, Cyrus turned his gaze westward toward Lydia, a wealthy kingdom in Anatolia ruled by King Croesus, the richest man in the world. The story of their encounter has become legendary. Croesus, famed for his wealth and confidence, consulted the Oracle of Delphi before launching a war against Persia. The oracle famously declared, "If you cross the Halys River, you will destroy a great empire." Confident, Croesus took the prophecy as a promise of victory. He marched east and indeed, a great empire was destroyed. But it wasn't Cyrus's dot. In a masterful campaign, Cyrus outmaneuvered Croesus, besieged Sardis, and brought Lydia under Persian control. The victory sent shockwaves across the ancient world. Yet, in true Cyrus fashion, he spared Croesus's life and made him an advisor. Mercy, not vengeance, became his hallmark. And in doing so, Cyrus earned something most conquerors never do: loyalty from the conquered. But Cyrus's ambition didn't stop there. Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia, stood as the ultimate prize. Its walls were massive, its people proud, and its rulers convinced of their divine invincibility. Yet in 539 BCE, Cyrus achieved the unthinkable. Without a prolonged siege, he entered Babylon in triumph. According to the Cyrus Cylinder, one of the most extraordinary artifacts in human history, he declared himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He restored temples, freed the oppressed, and allowed exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands. That cylinder, often hailed as the world's first charter of human rights, reveals the soul of the Achaemenid idea, that empire could be a partnership, not tyranny. "I am Cyrus, king of the world," the inscription reads, "whose heart the gods love." And indeed, the gods, or perhaps fortune itself, seemed to favor him. By the time of his death in 530 BCE, Cyrus ruled an empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indus River, from Egypt's frontiers to the mountains of Central Asia. Yet he remained, in his own eyes, a servant of justice. He built roads, established couriers, and ensured that his empire was connected not just by force, but by faith and a shared destiny. But every empire's foundation hides a shadow. Even as Persia thrived under Cyrus, the seeds of overreach were being planted. His successors would inherit not just his glory, but the impossible task of holding together a world too vast for any single ruler. Cyrus died during a campaign against nomadic tribes on the empire's northeastern frontier. His tomb at Pasargadae, a simple yet majestic stone monument, still stands a silent echo of the man who changed the world. On it, an inscription is said to have read, "O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, I am Cyrus, who founded the Persian Empire. Do not begrudge me this bit of earth that covers my body." The shepherd's son had become a king of kings. But as the dust settled on the empire he built, a question lingered in the desert winds. Could his successors preserve what he had begun, or would their ambition destroy it all? The answer would emerge soon, in the reign of a man who would turn Cyrus's dream of order into a system so efficient, so vast that it would define imperial rule for centuries to come. His name was Darius, and his rise would change everything. Chapter 2. Darius the Organizer and the Empire of Gold. Have you ever seen power so immense that it begins to devour itself? After Cyrus's death, Persia stood unmatched but fragile. His vision of a just empire was now a vast living machine, pulsing across deserts and mountains, but held together by loyalty to one man who was gone. And in that void, ambition stirred. For where one world ends, another waits to rise. When the great king fell in the eastern wilderness, his sons, Cambyses and Bardia, inherited a throne built on both glory and uncertainty. Cyrus had conquered the world, but he had not yet taught it how to rule itself without him. The empire, rich, young, and restless, hung in the balance. Cambyses, his eldest son, was fierce, commanding, and determined to prove worthy of his father's legacy. His campaign into Egypt in 525 BC was both a triumph and a tragedy. The pharaoh Psamtik III fell swiftly, and for the first time. The Persians gazed upon the temples of Memphis and the mysteries of the Nile. Yet as Cambyses lingered in the foreign land, paranoia and grief began to cloud his mind. The whispers say he killed his own brother Bardia out of fear of rebellion, though none could be sure because shortly after, a man claiming to be Bardia appeared in the capital, crowned himself king, and declared himself the true son of Cyrus. Was he real? Or an impostor? The truth was buried beneath layers of fear and rumor. But one man among the Persian nobles, an observant and calculating prince named Darius, suspected the truth that this Bardia was no royal son at all, but a magus, a priestly usurper named Gomata. Darius gathered 6 loyal nobles, stormed the royal palace, and slew the false king. That day, in blood and secrecy, Darius I seized the throne, not by birthright, but by destiny. And yet, he faced a problem no sword could solve. Across the empire, rebellions ignited like wildfire. Babylon rose again in defiance, Egypt stirred, Media resisted, and satrap after satrap proclaimed themselves independent. To the world, Darius looked like a usurper clutching a collapsing empire. To survive, he would have to become more than a conqueror. He would have to become an architect of order. And so began one of the greatest administrative revolutions in history. Imagine this empire stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River. Over 50 million people, speaking dozens of languages, worshipping hundreds of gods. Darius looked upon it and saw not chaos but potential. He divided his realm into 20 great provinces called satrapies, each ruled by a governor, the satrap. These men wielded immense power, but Darius made sure none could betray him. Each satrap was watched by royal inspectors, the king's eyes and ears men, whose loyalty was owed only to the throne. To hold the empire together, Darius built the arteries of power, the royal roads. These vast highways linked distant lands, allowing couriers to travel thousands of miles in days. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night stops these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. Herodotus would later write, that line, echoing even in modern postal mottos, was born in the empire of Darius. Through these roads flowed not just messages, but identity. The empire became a living organism. Every order, every decree, every whisper of revolt could reach the great king in a heartbeat. But Darius's genius wasn't only in governance, it was in faith and finance. He understood that gold, not war, sustained empires. Under his rule, Persia created a standardized currency, the daric, stamped with the image of the king himself. Trade exploded. Markets from Egypt to India pulsed with Persian coins, and the wealth of nations poured into Persepolis, the empire's glittering capital. And Persepolis, it was no mere city. It was a vision made stone. Rising from the plains of Fars, its terraces and halls glimmered with polished limestone and gold. Columns soared like forests of marble. Carvings showed envoys from every nation bearing tribute, and on its stairways, the world itself seemed to climb toward the throne. Darius called it Passa, the heart of the empire. Yet for all his grandeur, Darius never forgot the lessons of Cyrus. He ruled not as a tyrant, but as a lawgiver. He codified the empire's laws, respected the faiths of his subjects, and allowed each people to worship their gods freely. But this harmony was not weakness, it was control through consent. A people who felt respected rarely rebelled. Still, Darius faced storms that no policy could quiet. In the far west, beyond the Aegean, small city-states were stirring restless, defiant, and fiercely independent. The Greeks. At first, they seemed insignificant compared to Persia's might, mere dots on a map. But when the Ionian Greeks, subjects of Persia in Asia Minor, rebelled in 499 BCE, Darius saw it as more than an inconvenience. It was a challenge to his authority. He crushed the revolt, but one act set him ablaze with vengeance: the burning of Sardis, a Persian capital, by Athenian hands. Darius vowed revenge, not just against the rebels, but against Athens itself. He ordered his servants to remind him daily, "Master, remember the Athenians." This vow led to the first great collision between East and West. In 490 BCE, Persian armies sailed across the Aegean to punish Greece. They landed on the plain of Marathon, where the Athenians, vastly outnumbered, awaited them. What happened next would shock the ancient world. The Persians, confident and organized, advanced in overwhelming numbers. But the Athenians charged, shields locked, and broke the Persian line in a thunderous clash of bronze and fury. The Persians fled to their ships, leaving thousands of dead on the sands. The great king's army beaten by a handful of free citizens. When the news reached Darius, he was silent. For years he had believed that the empire was eternal, that no mortal could defy its will. Marathon shattered that illusion. The empire could bleed. Darius swore to return and finish what he had begun, but fate denied him. Rebellions in Egypt called him back, and before he could march again on Greece, he fell ill and died in 486 BC. He left behind a legacy unmatched, a web of administration so intricate that it would endure long after his dynasty was gone. On his tomb at Nakshi Rustam, carved high into the cliff, he left a message to the ages: "By the grace of Ahura Mazda, I am king. I am not hot-tempered. I am just. I am a friend to the right." But his death opened the gates once more to ambition. His son, Xerxes, inherited both the throne and his father's unfinished vengeance. Where Darius had sought order, Xerxes sought glory. He would raise the largest army the world had ever seen. He would cross the sea itself on bridges of boats. He would bring Greece to its knees, or so he believed. And so, as the fires burned in Persepolis and the banners of the empire rose once again, the world held its breath. Because when the god-king marched west, he would find not surrender, but defiance that would echo for millennia. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 3, Xerxes' Ambition, the God-King and the Fall of Hubris? Chapter 3, Xerxes' Ambition, the God-King and the Fall of Hubris. Have you ever witnessed a man so certain of his destiny that he mistook it for divinity? The Empire of Persia, born from the vision of Cyrus and perfected by Darius, now stood at the height of its power. Yet, within that golden perfection, a single flaw began to gleam: a young king's hunger not for justice, but for immortality. When Darius the Great died, his empire was the envy of the known world. Gold flowed through his palaces, ambassadors from distant lands knelt before his throne, and the name Persia inspired both reverence and fear. But for his son, Xerxes I, it was not enough to inherit the world, he wanted to reshape it. From the moment of his coronation in 486 BCE, Xerxes bore not just the weight of a crown, but the shadow of his father's unfinished war. The humiliation of Marathon still burned in Persian memory. To Xerxes, it was more than a defeat. It was an insult carved into the soul of the empire. And insults to Persia could only be washed away by conquest. But the young king was not Cyrus, the merciful builder, nor Darius, the patient architect. Xerxes was fire-brilliant, consuming, and unpredictable. His court reflected this new era of splendor and danger. In Persepolis, banquets overflowed with gold cups and rare wine, while envoys from Egypt, Babylon, and India bowed before the King of Kings. Yet behind the grandeur, a storm was forming. Egypt rebelled soon after his ascension, a test of his resolve. Xerxes crushed it without hesitation. Babylon followed, believing the new king might show mercy as Cyrus once had. He did not. Xerxes tore down their temples, melted their idols, and stripped the city of its ancient dignity. To the world, it was a message: mercy was dead. The empire would no longer persuade, it would command. And then, with his dominion secure, Xerxes turned his eyes west. He summoned his generals, architects, and engineers to Susa, and unveiled a plan so audacious it seemed divine. He would not merely invade Greece, he would subdue the gods of Greece themselves. The invasion would be no ordinary war. It would be a march of nations, an ocean of men and beasts. His father's failure would become his triumph, and in its glory, his name would eclipse all before him. The preparations began years in advance. From every corner of the empire, soldiers gathered: Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Indians, even Scythians from the cold north. Some came willingly, others under the weight of tribute. The armies converged like rivers feeding into a sea. By the time Xerxes stood ready to march, he commanded what Herodotus would later call the greatest force ever assembled, more than 2 million men. Though the true number was likely less, still unimaginably vast. But it wasn't enough to march. The god-king would command the very elements. To reach Greece, his army needed to cross the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe. For lesser men, it was an obstacle. For Xerxes, it was an opportunity to demonstrate his divinity. He ordered his engineers to build 2 colossal bridges of boats, stretching across the mile-wide waters, bound by rope and anchored by sheer will. When a storm destroyed them, the great king's fury became legend. He ordered the sea itself to be whipped 300 times and branded with hot irons, as if nature could be punished for its disobedience. Then, unshaken, he commanded the bridges rebuilt, and this time they held. When Xerxes finally crossed the Hellespont in 480 BCE, the earth trembled under his army's march. They carried with them not just weapons, but entire nations, an empire on the move. Behind him followed fleets of ships so numerous they turned the sea black. The invasion was no longer about vengeance. It was about eternity. Xerxes would not merely conquer Greece. He would erase it. But across the Aegean, in the city-states of Athens and Sparta, word of the Persian advance spread like fire in dry grass. The Greeks, so often divided by rivalry and pride, now faced annihilation. And for the first time in living memory, they stood together. Imagine it. Farmers, poets, and philosophers, preparing to face the might of the world's greatest empire. The contrast was staggering. The Greeks fought for freedom, the Persians for dominion. The first test came at Thermopylae, the narrow pass between mountain and sea. There, a small Greek force, led by King Leonidas of Sparta, made its stand. They knew they could not win, but they could delay. As Xerxes approached, he saw before him a handful of men blocking his empire's path. He offered them mercy if they surrendered their weapons. Leonidas's reply became immortal: "Come and take them." The Persians attacked wave after wave, and each time, the Spartans held. For 2 days, Xerxes watched his finest soldiers fall against an army that refused to kneel. On the 3rd day, a local traitor revealed a hidden path through the mountains, and Persian troops encircled the defenders. Leonidas and his men fought to the last, their courage buying Greece precious time. When Xerxes surveyed the field, he did not see a victory. He saw defiance. He ordered Leonidas's head to be displayed on a pike, yet even in death, the Spartan king's defiance echoed across Greece. The Persians marched south, burning cities, seizing lands, and finally reaching Athens itself. The city was empty. The Athenians had fled to their ships, leaving behind a silent capital. Xerxes ordered it burned. Flames devoured the temples, the Parthenon's precursor, the sacred altars of the gods. For a moment, the King of Kings stood triumphant amid the smoke and ruin, the Athenian Acropolis burning beneath his gaze. He believed the prophecy fulfilled Greece was his. But the gods had other plans. Off the coast, near a narrow strait called Salamis, the Athenian general Themistocles prepared his trap. The Persian fleet, vast but unwieldy, was lured into the confined waters. Xerxes watched from a golden throne on the shore as the battle began. He expected to witness the destruction of the Greek navy. Instead, he saw chaos. Greek triremes, smaller and faster, struck with precision. The Persians, trapped by their own numbers, collided with one another. The sea turned to wreckage and blood. When the smoke cleared, the impossible had happened again. The Persians had been defeated. It was the turning point. Xerxes' invincible illusion began to crack. His pride, once a blazing sun, now cast long shadows. The great king fled back to Asia, leaving part of his army behind under General Margonius, who would later fall at Plataea, sealing Persia's defeat. For the first time in history, the empire that claimed to rule the world had been stopped. Back in Persepolis, the silence of failure hung heavy. Xerxes withdrew into his palaces, surrounding himself with luxury, rituals, and pleasure. But power built on fear decays from within. Conspiracies brewed in his court. The nobles whispered of hubris, the ancient curse of kings who believed themselves gods. And one night, in the shadows of his own empire, the god-king fell not to an army, but to a knife. Xerxes was assassinated by his own guards, his blood staining the marble floors of the palace he had built to proclaim eternity. Yet even in death, his story refused to end. For what he unleashed, the clash between East and West, empire and freedom, would echo through centuries. The Greeks would never forget the fire that consumed their temples. Nor would the Persians forget the defiance of men who stood against an empire. But as the crown passed to his son, Artaxerxes I, a quiet transformation began within Persia itself. The empire no longer sought conquest, it sought survival. And far to the west, among the ruins of Greece, a new generation was rising. One day, their eyes would turn east, toward the golden empire of Persia. The winds were shifting once again. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 4, The Long Twilight from Artaxerxes to the Edge of Conquest? Chapter 4, The Long Twilight from Artaxerxes to the Edge of Conquest. Have you ever watched an empire try to hold on to its greatness long after the fire has faded? There is something haunting in the silence after glory, the kind of silence that fills empty palaces and echoes through corridors once alive with victory. The Achaemenid Empire, once a roaring blaze under Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes, now flickered like a lamp running out of oil. Yet for all its fading light, its beauty still dazzled the world. When Xerxes I fell to an assassin's blade, the world's largest empire was shaken to its core. The man who had tried to rule the world as a god now lay cold beneath his own marble halls. But Persia did not crumble. It did what great empires do: it adapted, reshaped, and pretended nothing had changed. Into this fragile calm stepped his son, Artaxerxes I, a man raised in the shadow of both magnificence and madness. Artaxerxes had inherited an empire that stretched farther than any before it, yet one that carried wounds no crown could hide. His first act was to restore order in the palace. He punished the conspirators who killed his father, executed generals who questioned him, and reasserted royal control with quiet ruthlessness. Yet unlike his father, Artaxerxes sought no divine glory. He preferred stability over conquest, and perhaps for the first time, the empire turned inward. But peace under an empire that large was a delicate illusion. From Egypt to Bactria, the provinces pulsed with rebellion. Each satrap, once the king's loyal hand, had begun to feel the weight of his own power. The Persian system that Darius had built to maintain unity was beginning to strain under its own complexity. Communication faltered, loyalty wavered, and gold, once the empire's strength, became its poison. The royal court overflowed with tribute, but corruption spread through its veins like rot beneath polished marble. Still, Artaxerxes was not a weak ruler. He played a long, clever game, one built on patience and persuasion. When revolts rose in Egypt, he sent generals instead of marching himself, preferring diplomacy and wealth to exhaustion by war. When Greek mercenaries fought in Asia Minor, he countered not with soldiers, but with silver, bribing one city-state against another. Why destroy what gold can buy? He is said to have told his court. And it worked, at least for a time. Persia's influence seeped back into Greece through money and politics, a quieter form of conquest. The once defiant city-states now relied on Persian gold to fight each other. The empire had learned that power need not always roar. Sometimes it could whisper. Yet whispers have a way of turning into rumors, and rumors into rebellion. As the decades passed, the empire's unity began to fracture beneath the surface. The satraps grew restless, their loyalty increasingly measured not by duty, but by opportunity. Generals became kings in everything but name. Even the once glorious royal road, lifeline of the empire, grew dangerous in places where bandits and rebels claimed tolls in defiance of the crown. The court at Persepolis glittered on, blind to the decay spreading beyond its gates. There, kings held festivals of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god, while eunuchs and courtiers schemed in shadows. The empire that had once celebrated diversity now began to drown in its own contradictions. Its people still called their ruler the King of Kings, but fewer and fewer believed it. When Artaxerxes I died, the succession tore the royal family apart. His sons fought for the throne, each claiming legitimacy. Blood stained the palace floors again, and for a moment, it seemed Persia might tear itself apart. Out of this chaos emerged Darius II, known to history as Darius the Bastard. His reign was marked by intrigue, betrayal, and ceaseless rebellion. Yet for all the turmoil, the empire somehow endured. It limped forward, proud but wounded, magnificent but weary. And then came the next king, Artaxerxes II, the longest reigning monarch in Persian history. Under him, the empire stretched again to its former glory in appearance, if not in spirit. His reign began in blood, as his brother, Cyrus the Younger, sought to overthrow him. The story of their conflict would become one of the most dramatic in Persian legend. Cyrus, ambitious and beloved by many of the satraps, gathered an army that included 10,000 Greek mercenaries, hardened soldiers from the very land Xerxes had once tried to conquer. Together, they marched deep into Mesopotamia to seize the throne. At Cunaxa, near Babylon, the brothers' armies met. The battle was fierce, brutal, and tragic. Cyrus fought like a lion, cutting his way toward his brother, but in his moment of triumph, he was struck down. Artaxerxes wept when he saw the body of his brother carried to him, yet his tears did not stop the executions that followed. The rebellion failed, but what followed was even more extraordinary. The Greek mercenaries, stranded deep in enemy territory after their employer's death, began a desperate retreat across the empire. Their leader, Xenophon, would later write of their journey in the Anabasis, a tale that spread across Greece like wildfire. For the first time, the Greeks had seen the Persian heartland, and they discovered it was not invincible. Artaxerxes II continued to rule for decades, balancing on the edge between brilliance and exhaustion. He fought to maintain Persia's grip on Egypt, to control the restless satraps of Asia Minor, and to keep the Greeks divided through diplomacy and gold. Yet beneath the surface, his empire was aging. The bureaucracy had grown bloated, the army decadent. Noble families feuded for influence, and corruption seeped through the once proud ranks of the satrapies. In his later years, the old king built temples and restored cities, trying to emulate Cyrus's vision of harmony. But the world had changed. The peoples of the empire no longer looked to Persepolis with awe, they looked with resentment. The tribute demanded from conquered lands grew heavier, the loyalty lighter. When Artaxerxes II finally died, he left behind a realm vast and beautiful, but fragile as glass. His successor, Artaxerxes III, tried to restore order through force. He reconquered rebellious Egypt, crushing its priests and pharaohs with ruthless precision. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed Persia might reclaim its old fire. The court celebrated, roads bustled again, and the old glory returned to its temples. But power built on terror is like a flame burning in dry wood. It consumes quickly, then dies. The twist came not from an enemy army, but from within the royal palace itself. Artaxerxes III, the restorer, was poisoned by his own minister Bagoas, a eunuch who had become the empire's unseen ruler. Bagoas placed his own puppet, Artaxerxes IV, on the throne, only to kill him soon after when he grew too independent. The once great empire of Cyrus had become a theater of assassins and courtiers, where the real power lay not in kings, but in whispers. When Darius III finally ascended the throne, Persia was a shadow of what it once was. The satraps ruled their provinces like private kingdoms. The army, once disciplined and loyal, was fractured by corruption. The royal treasury overflowed with gold, but the empire was hollow within. Darius was not a fool. He saw the cracks, but he could not seal them in time. And beyond the empire's western frontier, in the rugged hills of Macedon, a new name was rising: Alexander. The Persian court dismissed him at first. A boy king from a barbarian land, they said. No threat to the king of kings, but Alexander was no ordinary prince. He had been raised on stories of Greece's humiliation at Persian hands, taught that to destroy Persia was to avenge his ancestors. While Darius struggled to unite his fracturing empire, Alexander forged his under-iron discipline. The hunter had become the hunted. And when the storm finally broke, it came fast and merciless. But that is where our next chapter begins, the meeting of two worlds, one at its zenith of ambition, the other at the edge of destiny. Persia had built the first true empire of mankind, but in its final hour, it would face an enemy who fought not for tribute or wealth, but for immortality. The horizon of Asia was darkening. The thunder of hooves echoed once again. The world's greatest empire was about to meet its reckoning. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 5, The Fall of the Achaemenids, Alexander and the End of an Empire? Chapter 5, The Fall of the Achaemenids, Alexander and the End of an Empire. Have you ever watched two storms collide, one ancient and fading, the other young and unstoppable? When they meet, the world itself trembles. That is how it was when Alexander met Persia. It was not merely the clash of armies. It was the collision of two destinies, one at its twilight, the other at its dawn. By the time Darius III took the throne of Persia, the empire of Cyrus the Great was already a wounded giant. Its palaces still shone, its roads still stretched across continents, and its treasuries still overflowed with gold, but its spirit had begun to fracture. The people no longer whispered of divine kings and eternal order. They whispered of greed, betrayal, and fear. Darius, earnest but untested, inherited not an empire at its peak, but one slowly sinking under the weight of its own perfection. Far to the west, across the mountains of Anatolia, a young Macedonian king had risen. Alexander, son of Philip II, had been schooled by Aristotle, forged in battle, and taught from childhood that his destiny was divine. He dreamed of conquest not as plunder, but as transformation. His father had unified Greece. Alexander would take Greece's vengeance east. Persia was more than an enemy, it was the shadow that had haunted the Hellenic world for a century. When word of Philip's assassination reached the Persian court, the satraps laughed. They believed Macedonia would fall into chaos, that this boy king would never hold it together. But Alexander's rise was swift, merciless, and total. Within 2 years he crushed rebellion in Greece, united the city-states, and turned his gaze across the Aegean in the spring of 334 BCE. Alexander's army, no more than 40,000 men, crossed into Asia Minor. Compared to Persia's legions, it was a mere spark. But sparks, in the right wind, can ignite worlds. The first clash came at the river Granicus, where Persian satraps gathered to repel the invader. They expected a timid crossing, a cautious campaign. Instead, Alexander charged headlong into the current, his silver-plumed helmet gleaming beneath the sun. The Persians broke beneath the shock of his assault. Their lines scattered. Their satraps fell. The Macedonian king stood victorious on Persian soil. It was the first crack in an empire built to be eternal. As news of the defeat reached Darius, panic spread through his court. But the King of Kings did not retreat. He summoned his armies from the east, called forth horsemen from Bactria, archers from Susa, and chariots plated in steel. He would meet this Macedonian boy himself. The two empires would clash for the fate of the world. They met near the city of Issus in 333 BCE, a narrow plain hemmed by mountains and sea. Darius's army outnumbered Alexander's several times over, a shimmering expanse of men and banners stretching beyond sight. Yet numbers can be a curse. The narrow terrain favored the Greeks. As the Persians struggled to maneuver, Alexander struck like lightning swift. Precise, relentless. In the chaos, the young king's cavalry pierced through the Persian center, driving straight toward Darius's chariot. The great king, seeing the Macedonian phalanx slicing through his elite guard, lost his nerve. He turned his horses and fled. His army, seeing their god-king retreat, crumbled. The battlefield became a rout. For the first time in history, a Persian king had abandoned his men. The ancient aura of invincibility shattered. Among the captured spoils were Darius's family, his mother, wife, and daughters whom Alexander treated with a respect that stunned even the Persians. He bowed before them, promising their safety. In that gesture, Alexander showed not just magnanimity, but strategy. He knew the empire he sought to conquer could only be won by its people's belief, not merely their defeat, yet victory brought him no peace. Darius fled east, rallying what strength remained, and sent letters offering negotiation. Alexander refused. "You call yourself King of Kings," he replied. "Come and fight for it." For 2 years the chase continued. Alexander marched deeper into the empire, through Syria, Phoenicia, and Egypt. One by one, the Persian satrapies fell not because their armies were destroyed, but because their loyalty had long since withered. Cities opened their gates to him, not out of fear, but fatigue. In Egypt, the priests even crowned him as pharaoh. And in the desert of Siwa, the oracle of Ammon hailed him as the son of Zeus. Alexander began to believe what others only whispered, that he was divine, but Persia was not yet finished. Darius, gathering the remnants of his power, prepared for one final confrontation. The place would be Gaugamela, near the ancient city of Nineveh. There, in 331 BCE, the greatest armies of their age would meet. Darius's force was immense, hundreds of thousands strong, bolstered by war elephants and scythed chariots, stretching across the plain like an ocean of bronze. He had chosen open ground this time, the perfect field for his numbers. The night before the battle, Darius prayed to Ahura Mazda for victory. Alexander in his tent studied the stars. Both men knew that the dawn would decide not just who ruled Persia, but who would define history. When the sun rose, the plains of Gaugamela glittered with the reflections of countless spears. Darius waited on his chariot, surrounded by bodyguards, as Alexander's smaller army advanced in perfect formation. The Macedonians angled right, luring the Persians to stretch their lines. When the moment came, Alexander saw the opening, just as his father had taught him, and charged. His cavalry smashed into the Persian flank, punching straight toward Darius. The King of Kings watched the dust rising, heard the thunder of hooves, and once again he fled. The second retreat was fatal. The illusion of divinity was gone. His army disintegrated. Gaugamela was not just a defeat. It was the unmaking of an empire. As Darius fled eastward into Bactria, his own satraps turned against him. One, Bessus, betrayed him, capturing and eventually murdering the fallen king. When Alexander found Darius's body, left abandoned in the dust, he wept. Then, in an act of eerie symbolism, he ordered the Persian king buried with full honors, declaring himself Darius's successor. In that moment, The Achaemenid Empire ended not in fire or conquest, but in a single breath of mercy. Alexander had not destroyed it. He had inherited it, but what he built upon its ruins was something stranger, a vision that blurred the line between conqueror and heir. He took Persian robes, adopted Persian customs, and married Darius's daughter. He kept the satraps but replaced their loyalty with his own name. The courtiers called him King of Asia. The soldiers began to whisper that their general was becoming too Persian. The irony was cruel. The empire that Cyrus had built to unite nations was now uniting again, but under the son of a foreign king. Alexander had absorbed Persia's dream of universal order and made it his own. The conqueror had become the inheritor of the very world he'd set out to destroy. Yet, even as he built his new capital at Babylon, unease grew around him. The Greeks resented his Persian ways. The Persians distrusted his restless ambition. Alexander ruled over two civilizations that would never truly become one. He dreamed of merging East and West, but his soldiers dreamed only of going home. In 323 BCE, at the age of 32, Alexander died suddenly in Babylon, perhaps from fever, perhaps from poison, perhaps from the exhaustion of living too intensely for too long. His empire, like Persia's before him, had been forged by vision and held together by will. And like Persia's, it began to collapse the moment its creator was gone. But even in its fall, something extraordinary happened. The Persian system of governance, language, and roads survived within Alexander's empire and beyond. The world that followed the Hellenistic kingdoms, the Roman administrative model, even later empires of the Middle East all bore the fingerprints of the Achaemenids. The dream of Cyrus, that a world could be ruled not merely by power but by order and tolerance, refused to die. The ashes of Persepolis still glowed. Travelers who walked its ruins centuries later would stand among the toppled columns and carved processions and feel the weight of something eternal. Empires rise and fall, kings live and die. But ideas, those invisible empires, linger long after their thrones have turned to dust. And so, the story of the Achaemenid Persian Empire ends as it began, not with destruction, but with transformation. From a shepherd's son who dreamed of unity, to a god-king undone by his pride, to a foreign conqueror who became its heir. Persia's legacy outlived its walls and its wars. But here's the question history never fully answers. Did Alexander truly conquer Persia, or did Persia, with its irresistible grandeur and eternal vision, quietly conquer him? The sands of time buried the empire's cities, but not its spirit. And in every empire that followed, the shadow of Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes stretched quietly across the world, whispering still that power alone never lasts, but the dream of order always does.